Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episode, and this episode actually uh, we will discuss about the industry innovations and infrastructures. We have our expert, Mr. Rob, Dr. Erics, and Professor David. So I want to start from Mr. Rob. So how are you today? How is everything? And how do you want to analyze today's topic, especially industry innovations and infrastructures?
All right, we'll give it a shot, assuming you can hear me. I'm still waking up. So the infrastructure has turned out to be a pretty big problem actually before the pandemic. What often happens in developed nations is they let the infrastructure go after it's been built and don't maintain it properly. And so it provides a long-term opportunity and a problem for those nations to correct, getting ever more expensive as time goes on, and making it even harder to find the funding to make it happen. And the end result, of course, is that as the infrastructure erodes, then you have spot outages and problems, which we've certainly experienced here in the States, everything from bridge failures to electrical infrastructure problems where the infrastructure wasn't hardened enough for weather. So it's a serious issue that doesn't get enough attention.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Eric.
Yes. So I should preface that, my knowledge of, how industry works and how infrastructure works and such are only peripheral, from what I read and kind of what I see. And I don't often, I don't have an in-depth knowledge of it as some other experts here may have. But at the same time, I somewhat, pretty much agree with Rob, is that many nations, many regions and cities and everything are often careless about their infrastructure. They build it once and they hope that this is the thing that they can do and make it last forever. And one of the things that I notice, one of the beauties of having the internet is the availability of seeing other nations' current images of other nations right now, today. And what you see here in the United States is an infrastructure that was more or less built post-World War II. It was really jacked up post-World War II with the highways and the skyscrapers and all that were built during then. And since we built those during that time in the 1950s, we haven't done much in any additional. These are the hardware infrastructures I'm talking about, not necessarily some other aspects of it, like the systemic parts and other things. But even then, it's still pretty much set in ice, right? Even our educational infrastructure has not changed. Our transportation infrastructure has not changed. Our government infrastructure has somewhat changed, but not that much. And then you look around the world and you see how things are in other nations. And not only can you see it, I can also travel there and see it. And you notice that they have taken over. And, what used to be America being the leader of the world in terms of infrastructure is now woefully way behind. There are other nations around the world that we here in America think as like, oh my God, they're back in the Stone Ages. And particularly, the derogatory views of Africa, for example, and also the subcontinent Asia, India, and Bangladesh and Pakistan. Everybody here in America thinks, oh, they're a bunch of turban wearing blah blah blahs and all these other stuff. And they don't realize is that a lot of these, nations are fully functional megalopolises, with top-notch infrastructures and sleek, boulevards and all these things and brand new high-rises and all that. And we're sitting here thinking that they're still living in huts, but we're the ones that's actually living in huts in a way. So that's my take of the infrastructure, is that the Americans are a little bit too lazy in that, and they're not really seeing the rest of the world.
Thank you, Professor David.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And I say morning because it is morning in Phoenix, Arizona, wherever in the world you happen to be. And so I'll be sipping on my coffee as we go. I guess that's my personal infrastructure. But tying in industry, innovation, and infrastructure together, we've touched a little bit on traditional infrastructure, bridges, roads, airports, seaports. Maybe the previous comments didn't address all of those specifically, but I felt the overtone of the traditional infrastructure. My background is in IT infrastructure. That's what I did for 20 some years. And I've seen that change considerably. And I saw forward thinking companies that started maybe 5, 10 years ago, building out a different type of IT infrastructure as the cost of brick and mortar buildings for expansion, especially in areas like call centers, got to be very expensive. And there was a desire for people to want to be able to work maybe one day up to all 5 days at home instead of coming into the office. A couple of these forward thinking companies that I worked with, Fortune 500 types, started building out an infrastructure, taking that money from the brick and mortar infrastructure and started placing it into IT infrastructure, and started at the company's expense providing computer equipment to individuals to work at home, started providing computer networking equipment, not using a virtual private network, a VPN, to be able to access the corporate network, but actually building out the network through a more hardened type of IT structure directly to the employees' homes. And that included not only what you would think of as computer, but also their telephone system, which by then had moved from the standard POTS line, as we used to call it, plain old telephone system, out to an IP system that worked in conjunction with the computer equipment that they had and the private network that they had built. When COVID came along, these people already had a good share of their workforce that could continue to work from home, and they had others that worked maybe partly from home that did use VPNs and still had provided some equipment. But we in the IT sector that were working with those companies then were in a better position to be able to push more people out of the office and into work at home during an emergency like COVID. So infrastructure comes packaged in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that I think about looking at the future is, well, I understand the importance of what we consider to be that infrastructure that we have always thought of, bridges and roads, for example, being probably the greatest ones. Those went into diminished capacity during the height of the COVID. And what was pushed to the limits was even the forward-thinking networks and ideas that had been coming about for 5 or 10 years. So we need to, as we look to the future, look at the kind of infrastructure that we need to build out and not just continue to sit on autopilot wanting to fund the same infrastructure that we have for the last 100 years. It's going to take the innovation part of what we're talking about today between industry and infrastructure, that innovation piece, to look at how we can best conduct business, personal business, corporate business as we move forward. So that's kind of my theme today.
Thank you. Professor Edward.
Hi, thank you. And I agree with a lot of what my colleagues have said. I can only be on for a few minutes, but two things strike me as important. First of all, yes, after World War II, especially in the industrialized countries and in the United States, we built up a lot of what we call traditional infrastructure, roads, airports, water, electricity, distribution, that sort of thing. Most of it was large and centralized. Transportation of course, is part of that. One of the problems was indicated is that a lot of times that infrastructure was not maintained. And a lot of times it was put there for political reasons. For example, in the Washington, D.C. area where I'm at, and in some other major cities, basically there was a whole trend of using light rail and subways. In other words, the assumption was that people were going to go into central cities, and rather than having roads, maybe they'll just have these subways and light trains, and everyone would go in that way. And wouldn't that be wonderful? And they were extremely costly per mile compared to a road or compared to a bus that had a dedicated bus lane. Extremely expensive. They gave lots of jobs initially to workers to build them, and then basically they were neglected. Here in the Washington, D.C. area, for example, we've gone through several years of our whole subway system, whole parts of it shutting down because of floods and fires and so forth, because there was no incentive to keep it maintained. So the first thing I do is, especially for countries that are emerging or developing or looking at what to do, is be a little bit suspicious of these sorts of projects because of the experience, certainly here in the United States. The second thing is, I love the way you frame this discussion about entrepreneurs, innovation, and infrastructure, because as David has suggested, looking ahead in the future, the needs for businesses, for enterprises and workers and so forth is going to probably be different. It is different than it was 30, 40, 50, or 60 years ago. So it's important to allow entrepreneurs to experiment with different ways of providing infrastructure and to think. We have a saying here: think outside of the box. Don't just think in your little compartment here. Look at different ways of doing it. Education is not a traditional infrastructure, but it's basically the key to all human progress, as far as I'm concerned, because the human mind is where all of our value comes from, all of our creativity comes from. And so in this country and in most Western countries, we have an education system that's based on the 19th century assembly line model. At 9 o'clock, the child has math poured into the heads, and they're all there in the class. And then at 10 o'clock, they go down the assembly line and they have writing or reading poured into their heads, and they go down the assembly line. That's not how children learn, and that's not the most efficient way of doing things. And it's very, very costly. And we're seeing alternatives emerge, certainly in the United States and certainly with COVID. And so my takeaway, or how I hope you guys think about it and talk about it when I get off of this call, is to think about how you can allow the entrepreneurship that has given rise to the fact that we're having this conversation right now across how many time zones? Wouldn't it be great if that innovation, that innovative energy is unleashed on infrastructure? It's interesting here in the United States where I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and there's a big push to have a maglev train going from Washington, D.C. to downtown Baltimore. Baltimore is about 40 miles up the road from Washington. But the problem is, it sounds really good. Wow, a futuristic infrastructure. But there's hardly any traffic that really needs to go from downtown Washington, D.C. to downtown Baltimore. And there are some slower trains that are much less costly that do that. So there's this temptation to say, wow, isn't this great? Let's pour a lot of government money into this infrastructure that's not going to be used very much and is going to cost 10 times or 20 times as much as alternatives. So those are my two lessons. Be careful of the big centralized plans and approaches, and allow entrepreneurs to flourish and come up with their own ideas and thinking of different ways of doing things, delivering services, maybe getting out of the old ways of thinking.
Thank you. I just want to add one point, because when we're discussing about industries, so what are the top 10 industries right now? Biggest industry even year 2021. So I just want to share this information. According to IBIS, number one, global life and health insurance. It's more than $43,000 billion. Global pensions, number 3. Global commercial real estate, number 4. Car and automobiles, number 5. Global car and automobile manufacturings, Direct General Insurance. Number 7, Global Commercial Bank. Number 8, Oil and Gas. Number 9, Auto Parts and Accessories. Number 10, Tourism. Still tourism. It's good point for Malaysia. So anyway, so
Can
yes,
yeah, before
yes.
I get off, I want to make a comment because this is a very instructive list that you've given us. At the top is healthcare. And for
Yes.
example, there are discussions in this country of maybe we should build, thousands of new hospitals. Maybe there's going to be another pandemic. Should we do that? Which without any thought about, first of all, the cost, whether it's efficient, which it is manifestly not. One of the places that you're almost insured to get sick is in a hospital. My father had been in and out of hospitals most of last year, and that's where he caught COVID, in a hospital. Fortunately, he survived, so that's the good news. But with wearable diagnostics, for example, and with being able to sequence your personal genome, which has gone from something like $100 million to $10 million to $1,000, or $10 million, I should say, with artificial intelligence that can monitor you in real time. We have a possibility of an infrastructure, certainly in the developed countries, but this would spread very quickly to the emerging economies, to be able to have tailored medicine for individuals. So in other words, you get rid of the whole, yes, if you have to have surgery, perhaps you would have to go into a hospital, but thinking of healthcare a completely different way. Right now, we don't have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system. If you get sick, then you go to a hospital, as opposed to maintaining your health. We talked about pensions. That was the second thing, I believe, on your list. And again, the way we think of it right now is that the government in this country takes a certain portion of your money and puts it into a government, what we call Social Security in this country. You're allowed to put a certain amount away yourself, but we don't really have a system of retraining people, because as our length of life expands, people are going to be working longer. That's the good news. They're going to be more productive. They're going to want to work longer rather than retire. But we need to think of a new way of doing a system. That's a form of infrastructure as well. So all of this is very exciting, and I hope that this discussion goes into how can we think outside of the box, as we like to say. So thank you very much for this incredible conversation.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Rob. Yes.
Well, on that theme of thinking outside the box, we have a lot of stuff coming that's technologically advanced and could change rather dramatically what it is we do, how we get around, how we get our services and the rest. And what often happens with regard to infrastructure projects is we go in and we spend a lot of money repairing what was there. And as has been pointed out earlier, a lot of what's there has been there for 50, 60 years or more. Things have progressed a great deal since then. And maybe it's time we started rethinking a lot of the constructs. For instance, we do have trials all over the world for flying automobiles, which would be deployed more like Uber and Lyft than they would be deployed as personal vehicles just because of their nature. But if you have those, why do you need as many roads? Couldn't you turn a lot of the freeways or a lot of the space in the freeways into green sections? You can fly over plants pretty easily, even in ground effect. We're talking about maglev trains. If anybody ever makes it to Singapore again, they've got a great maglev train system out there. And China's been one of the leaders in advanced train technology, taking much of the technology for the maglev out of Europe. The experience is fun, by the way. I bought as many tickets as I could, and I just spent a day going up and back to the airport on that train. It was like a ride at 300 miles an hour. It was
300 miles or kilometers?
Well, it was. I think I was actually running at kilometers, but the ceiling was. Thank you. The ceiling was, I think, 350 miles per hour was as fast as it could go, and it was really doing something like 300 kilometers, which quite a bit slower, but still it felt especially when the two trains passed each other, like it was going to come off the tracks. It was quite a bit of fun. One of the other interesting things, though, that kind of points to infrastructure is when they built the train, they evidently forgot to put in the air conditioning system for the center cabin. So you see this very modern train. Everything's ultra modern, modern doors, modern controls. And in the middle of the control center, there's this portable air conditioning system that's ducted to the outside, much like you might have in your living room, keeping the cabin cool because they forgot the air conditioning system, or at least it didn't have enough capacity to work properly. So it's one of the funny things you see when you're in China. Sometimes you'll see all this modern stuff, and then suddenly you'll see something that just looks like, well, somebody decided to fix this themselves with whatever they bought at the local hardware store, and it's quite a bit of fun. But it does speak to how infrastructure is treated. There are times when you need to look at what's there and decide if you can apply technology to make it better, cheaper, more reliable. I'm reminded of some of the funny stuff that happens with government. For instance, when I was growing up in Orange County, California, Walt Disney wanted to run a monorail to the airport, and it was supposed to cost $3.5 million. And so they ran a series of studies, and they found out that it wasn't going to be profitable. The studies cost $9 million. They could have built the thing 3 times over and found out if it was going to be profitable or not. And it would have been eventually. Just riding a monorail to Disneyland would have been an e-ticket ride, if you remember those things. But it's often the way government works is that they'll spend tons of money on studies. They'll spend tons of money on determining whether something will work or not. When a lot of times they could have built it cheaper, and found out that way. In California, we're trying to put in our first high-speed rail train, something that's common across Asia and Europe. And so far, no deal. Elon Musk has come up with Hyperloop, which could revolutionize ground-based travel. I'm still a little bit worried about how it would work in an earthquake area, but he claims it's actually safer. I'll let somebody else discover that at speed. But the idea of a Hyperloop is a 650 mile per hour ground-based conveyance that would take you from station to station very quickly. But then during the pandemic, we've discovered tools like this one where you don't necessarily need to travel to go other places. You've got concepts like telepresence, which we use for medical work. We could also use for virtual travel to just experience, even in short phases, what it's like to be in all parts of the world, and maybe cut down on the amount of time that we need to spend in airplanes, where we get kind of mixed messages about whether they're safe or not, depending if it's the airline industry talking to us or the CDC. So in the end, as we're looking at innovation and infrastructure, the two do come together and should, because we should be building for tomorrow, not for today. And I know several times I've pointed out that the housing market in particular has been kind of sideways because most of the houses are built out of designs that were popular during the 1930 World's Fair. And I mentioned that later, the Disney House of the Future was built using fiberglass. And when they tried to destroy it, the wrecking ball hit it and about blew itself out of the park. Just showing how much sturdier that design was based on fiberglass than traditional designs. Yet we still, to a large extent, build houses like we always did. When we know how to build houses that can withstand flood, can withstand wind, can withstand many of the natural disasters that are appearing due to global warming. And we probably should be building to those specs, not to the specs that existed out of the 1930s. Granted, in earthquake areas, they are required to handle a Category 7. But then, as we mentioned before, 3D houses can be built to handle a Category 8 or stronger. And China is again deploying those. And so much of the West is now falling behind much of the advancements that are happening in Asian countries, particularly China, that are ahead of the curve. But Singapore is no slouch, neither is South Korea. All great examples of applied technology to improve their situation that the West is not taking to heart, at least not largely. Parts of the EU, of course, are. Norway, Finland has been brought up in the past, but it's more the exception than the rule. So you can blend innovation and infrastructure and come up with something a lot better, probably a lot cheaper than just trying to rebuild what was there. And maybe that's what we ought to do.
Thank you, Mr. Rob. Dr. Eric, I have one specific thing because China has Belt and Road Initiative, and what we understand, not only actually China, even South Korea or Singapore. I want to share that Malaysia, even example India, even Bangladesh, and everywhere, a lot of infrastructures and many things happening through Belt and Road Initiative. So USA has any kind of plan like alternative of Belt and Road Initiative, or they are trying to applying any business strategy or something?
I cannot speak on behalf of what the U.S. government's going to be able to do in the next
Okay.
5, 10, 20, 50 years. That's a supposition with absolute no basis in reality because of all the different political factions involved and what happens. What happens in 2022 elections, 2024 elections could completely change the direction of where we will go in terms of what infrastructure will be. But I want to go back to our talking about infrastructure and the worry about the cost. I think those things are misguided. Cost should not be a factor other than understanding, well, cost should not be a factor other than avoiding corruption. Okay, the government, the U.S. government, as well as the Chinese government and the EU and whatever national government, they are currency issuers. They generate the money. There's the issue of cost is irrelevant at the federal level. Okay, so long as the money is validly being spent to pay the workers, pay the companies who are doing it at a reasonable profit and all that, there should not be an issue of cost. Secondly, also, is that infrastructure is not the plan of the infrastructure should not be where innovation occurs. Okay, infrastructure is a group decision by the nation, by the state, by the municipality, or whatever it is. It's a group decision to say, yes, we want to have this road. We want to have these buildings. We want to blah, blah, blah. Okay. It is creating the structure to allow for innovation. That's the whole point of infrastructure. Infrastructure is to create the opportunity for innovation to occur. One of the greatest examples of this is here in America, way back before the American Revolution, 1740s or so. Colonists in America were thinking, I think we really should have this infrastructure. I'm not going to tell you what it is at the moment. The thing is that we should really have this. And they had this design. They were mulling about it for about 40, 50 years. And after the revolution, after America became America, they finally decided to go ahead and build this, and they paid some obscene amount of money back then. Okay, right now it's actually quite cheap. And people thought when that was built, they had the same thought that many of other talkers, Professor Edward also had thought, like, why do we need this? Who is going to use this? All these things that everybody always says about infrastructure, like, why do we ever need a 6-lane highway or something like that? But they built it, and it's also curiosity. It was the last major infrastructure type program that was built that was done by hand, without any mechanical tools enhanced with mechanical energy of some sort. So this was hand built using draft animals and such, and it was the Erie Canal. Okay, the Erie Canal that connected basically, I guess, Lake Erie, all the way down to, well, actually, I think it was more like the base of the Niagara Falls, all the way to the Lawrence River, I believe. Okay, and basically it connected the Atlantic Ocean to the inland parts of the United States, Ohio, and all that other parts, western part of Pennsylvania. And when it was originally built, people go like, "What the hell? Why do we need something like this?" And it had, because the altitudes of the two places were not the same. They had locks, which means you have to go here, and then you have to get into a place, and you have to go up by filling up a little bit of a giant bathtub, and then you go across some more, and you go up, and and so forth, to go, I think, several hundred miles, not miles, several hundred feet, maybe like 500 feet total in altitude difference. And when they built it, they had no idea that this is something that would be useful, but it was extremely useful because innovation was developed because of the opportunity of this infrastructure being built. Okay, and the key innovation was that, hey, you can bring food from one area to another area without having it rot. Okay. Previously, to bring food from the grain fields of Ohio and such to New York and New York City was impossible. You cannot take the wheat that you grow there and carry it by horse through carriages and whatever and wagons to the metropolitan areas of the time, New York City and Philadelphia, by horse drawing carriages and wagons without it not getting rot, go spoil. And we actually had this thing called the Whiskey Rebellion that occurred because they figured that, since we can't get these wheat out there, we're just going to let it rot and make whiskey out of it, which is what they did. And then they had all the taxes and all these other stuff. And that was the only thing they could use with the grain that they were growing out there. Now that you had the Erie Canal, you can get it there quick enough that you can actually, produce it and sell it. And you quadruple the market for those people who are living in Ohio and the western parts of Pennsylvania that otherwise they had no market for. Okay. And then you also have tourism and all that, which is what the Erie Canal is used for now, is mainly for tourism. Very few people use the Erie Canal for transportation of goods now. Okay. But a lot of innovation occurred because of that. And a huge amount of technology was built into it because of the infrastructure. So infrastructure is not there to innovate for. Infrastructure is there to innovate from. Okay. And it's up to the people to decide and agree to, yes, let's do this type of infrastructure. And then once you do that, then the entrepreneurs will come in and say, we have 5G internet. Okay. Let's see what we can do with it. That's how you would do it. Okay. That's the agreement among the people. Hey, let's have this kind of a thing. Let's use this kind of a thing. And then we go ahead and with it. All right. No, it's not the other way around.
Yes.
There is, let me just finish a little bit. There is the part in the infrastructure is that once the people agree that, yes, we're going to build the Erie Canal, then it's up to the innovators and the entrepreneurs to sell to the actual private companies who are actually building it. Because this is a public-private partnership, right? The public, the government says, we want this road. The government isn't actually going to be building it. I mean, other than paying for it. They're not going to hire people. They're not going to do that. The government hires contractors, and the contractors build it. And hopefully the contractors build it at an agreed price, and they can meet that at that price. And in order for them to be profitable, they would have to find innovative ways of doing it for cheaper, okay, so that they can net the difference, okay? The government will say, we're going to pay you $1 billion to build this. The contractors are going to figure out how to do it for less than $1 billion so that they can make the money. And there is where entrepreneurs can come in and say, hey, I got this tool here that you can use to build it for cheap, okay? And that's where innovation can occur. And there the government sets the price, and then innovators can figure out how they can come in at a lower price. And that's how that would be done. But generally, the construction of the infrastructure is not meant immediately to be profitable or to be of value. Let the people figure out what to do with it once it's done. And then you will see all these new creation come in. So that mag left between DC and Baltimore, who needs to use it, blah, 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 all that. Just build it and watch what people can do with it. That's what I would say.
No, definitely. I also agree, because I have some engagement with few countries. They are developing 100 years of plan, and practically I saw that when they develop their infrastructure, ultimately their GDP growth. Like, let's say they're producing their foods in village. So when there is a roads and highways, they can forward it, send it to the like the capital city for selling their foods. And even though I give example for the mobile money transferring, then the mobile money transferring actually comes.
Exactly. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that wireless telephony turns into currency?
True.
But it does. That's what happens.
Then actually mobile phone comes. Then mobile money transferring comes, and And in the COVID-19 period, I observed that these are the countries, those who have strong infrastructure and the technological advantage, they are actually survive with their people. Anyway, yes, Professor David. Yeah.
You got to unmute.
Yes, I was. Well, an interesting conversation this morning, and I'm glad to see that innovation is the key factor that we're talking about here. Otherwise, both industry and infrastructure would be static. You know, we would build a highway and we would build cars and we would continue to use that. But where I want to go with the conversation now is to touch on what a couple of people have mentioned, which is the public-private partnership as we go through that. That's a term that we hear a lot. And I think that works best, of course, when the public sector and the private sector are both doing what they do best. And sometimes there's some tension over what that would be. For example, planning. We talked about doing planning or feasibility studies to see if certain things will work, and those typically had come into the area of the public doing those to see whether or not they could go ahead and build something. But we take the public apart just a little bit. What drives public decisions? Public decisions are driven by a great many things, but they're typically driven by politics. They're driven by votes. The people that want to stay in office in democracies need to be able to gather those votes, and they need to be able to gather money for campaigns. And those votes and the money for the campaigns may come from different sources. So those are the things that they have to keep. Those are the places they have to keep people happy. Typically, that means if money is coming from established businesses, those businesses then have a momentum in the products that they're selling now and how they're going about doing business. So that is more backward looking. And I don't mean backward as in unsophisticated, but I mean backward as is I have this infrastructure built, I have these industrial factories built, they are providing a certain amount of shareholder value each and every month. I want to continue that as I go forward. People that vote at the ballot box many times are voting on what their current situation is. And maybe they're not looking as far down the road as some of us would be on what's coming in the next 5 or 10 years. So what's keeping me happy now? So you have the two major elements of politics saying, let's maintain the status quo, let's maintain the current momentum, and if I have a comfortable lifestyle as a voter, let's maintain that. And if I don't, if there's some irritation there, then perhaps I'm open to things that can correct that. When you look at the entrepreneurs, where innovation comes from, they're many times, in my experience, looking at what can I do to bring about some change here. I can't go up against this manufacturer that's been building XYZ product for 10 years and has perfected sourcing and building and distributing this product. So I want to go in a different direction and bring something new. And there's plenty of folks. We talk about Elon Musk on this show a lot. He's doing that. He's taking things that we have a certain way of transporting, we have a certain way of building cars, we have a certain way of delivering internet, but I'm going to do it differently. And in doing that differently, that opens up opportunities for him. So that's the forward thinking part. We need all of those. We need what works. We need what can be possible for tomorrow that can work better for today. And what's in the center of all that? Well, I think it's a combination of that public-private partnership. If we can look over the fence say if I'm working in the public sector, which I did for a number of years, and if I can look over the fence and see what is currently working in industry, and if I can see what looks like could be emerging and could be useful in the area that I'm responsible for, if I can bring those people together and have conversations about how we move forward, that's good. That's going to be helpful. It's not going to stay static, but it can be very tough. And I think it can be very tough today as the situation changes rapidly, as it did like in COVID-19. So the companies that were already looking forward, as I pointed out earlier, the ones that were already building corporate infrastructure out to private homes so people could work at home, were in a much better condition to be able to respond because they hadn't got stuck in the static structure. They were looking forward, but they were maintaining that bottom line. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. There's a lot of moving parts, and there's no one right situation. Having discussions like this so that we can talk to people that vote, so that we can talk to people that run businesses and have them think forward, not just to what my profit and loss statement's going to look like at the end of the quarter, but how I can move this discussion, this profitability, this political environment, and move all of that forward. It's pretty tough, but it's pretty interesting at the same time. So, to put a couple of practical points on this, the medical industry uses a lot of technology, but they weren't using the kind of technology that we're using right now, this collaborative technology, this video technology. Maybe amongst themselves they were, but clearly not with patients. And that took government regulation here in the United States to be able to change that so that I did not have to go to a doctor physically during COVID-19 if I could do it virtually. And why did that take a government change? It took a government change because of the way insurance companies would pay for that visit to the doctor. So it goes back to this complexity of maintaining the past and working forward to the future. And sometimes these emergencies can be very helpful to push us in that direction, but we already had to have some momentum going in that direction to begin with. There already were this means of being able to communicate. Schools. I'm working with a couple of different schools. One's private, one's public. The private school already had a model for in-home delivery of classes. And it's not just the technology of being able to do the classes from a computer, but even how the classes were structured. Someone earlier had talked about the factory method of teaching, where you take 5 or 6 courses and you have a different period during the day or during the week to learn different things. Well, this private school had moved to, you're going to take one class, you're going to concentrate on that for a short period of time, you're going to be fully engulfed in that class. You're going to have to collaborate with other students in the class, and your professor is a completely different environment. And as I've worked with them, they have continued to work through COVID famously. They have not had to restructure. And as far as I know, their student load didn't diminish because of COVID. The public university has an online option, but they're still, their main focus is the brick and mortar, come to class, the traditional education environment that I grew up in decades ago, and they struggled more. They can learn from each other, one public, one private, but they have to have these conversations. So whatever we can do to perpetuate those conversations, it's one of the reasons that I'm into Arizona politics and into US politics, is to have those discussions with policy leaders, with elected officials, and try to get them to see that it's in their best interest to support this, at least in verbiage, until they're sure that they can get those votes and they can get that campaign money so that they can continue to stay in office. And it all ties together.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, as you are tech analyst, so what are the technology like will change our next few years? Even in the COVID situation, we have lot of challenge, but definitely technological market moving very fast. Even in Asia Pacific, we are observing many technology actually coming, and they are solving many problems. So what the innovation things you think, what are the top 5 or 10 technology will change our life?
Well, probably the number one thing is the influence of artificial intelligence on everything we see, touch, and feel. Much of the information will increasingly be curated by AIs. AIs will increasingly make the determinations as to where power, water, where you build, well, not so much where you build roads, but how you manage the roads that are already built. Automated traffic light systems to cut down on traffic and cut down on waste. That's probably the number one thing that we're going to see. Number two is sensors. Coupled with the AIs is a massive wave of sensors, some public, some private. The Ring doorbells, for instance, are getting pounded on today because somebody's claimed they're racist. But the fact is, police organizations across the nation are using them to identify problems and identify thieves and catch them. But they're also being used to once again regulate how the cities are run and keep track of where problems are. We can even triangulate if they hear a gunshot. They can triangulate. Systems can triangulate reasonably well where the gunshot originated if those systems are in place. So lots and lots of sensors, and that's going to be critical as we go forward with regard to the analytics that will be applied to decide where we spend money on infrastructure. We are moving it more and more into a data-driven world. And number three, of course, then would be the associated problem with data bias. We have a growing and significant problem with data bias, and these systems can be corrupted by data streams that have themselves been corrupted or not accurate. We're now this week discussing about I think it's the AstraZeneca virus tests used data that was out of date at the time that was put in place, which may invalidate those tests. That kind of showcases how data can be misused. So I'll throw in number three methods to overcome and correct data bias. Four probably falls into the area of transportation. The big thing, of course, we're observing is the shift from ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, to electric vehicles. Coincidentally, we just had a breakthrough on clean gasoline, clean artificial gasoline, which could eventually dampen the move to electric vehicles, because it would be a heck of a lot cheaper to put in gasoline that didn't cause pollution problems than it would be to convert all the existing infrastructure from gas to electric. But like most things, once we get on a roll, we're probably going to keep that roll pretty much to the end. So we'll see, but there is some conflict. So transportation changes. We've mentioned electric cars. Another big thing, moving from private ownership to services like Lyft and Uber. Ford's probably, of the OEMs, they're probably the most aggressive on that particular planning to convert themselves to that. And then number five, energy generation. We're going to need a lot more electricity, and there's a ton of work going into well, I should say energy generation and storage. The problem we have with electricity is we don't really have a great way to store it. The best way to store it, at least as far as I can see, that's clean and environmentally safe, is using hydroelectric facilities where you pump the water up when you're generating, and then you use the hydroelectric generators to generate on the off hours when you don't have wind or solar. But you're still losing an awful lot of energy in the process. We've got solid state batteries coming that look promising. Supercapacitors and ultracapacitors have looked promising for a while. And the energy density for those things have not been where they need to be to make them viable economically outside of commercial trucking in some of the areas where they're currently used. But that's probably the final area of massive change is how we generate power.
Thank
And
you.
that's
Thank you.
about 10 minutes.
Yes, yes. Dr. Eric.
Yeah. Again, going back to what some of the others have said, part of the problem, I think, is that in terms of innovation for the infrastructure, is that there are entities, there are parties that like the current infrastructure, and they want to milk it for as much as they can. There is inefficiencies in the current infrastructure because, technology moves forward, culture moves forward, and as we move forward, we like to have forward ideas and forward technologies implemented. But there are parties who are relying on the old stuff, okay? And they don't want the change because that would hurt their business model. And since they are well grounded and they are very massive, and in particular, I'm talking about like the oil industry, right? They are a multi-gazillion dollar industry, and they don't want to see oil become obsolete, okay? I personally think that the first thing they should do is just get off of it and just go boom, because what they are is not oil producers. They are energy producers. And if you think in terms of what is the most efficient way, what's the best way of getting energy and all that, it's just go to where it is rather than saying, oh, I got oil and I'm going to extract it and that's what I'm going to do. That's bullshit. That's an old way of thinking about this. And I've talked about this in terms of my story of John Henry, right? If you're a John Henry, you're going to use whatever way it is to dig that hole into the wall, into the side of the mountain. And you don't care whether it's going to be a 12-pound hammer or a steam power hammer or whatever it is, dynamite or whatever it takes. Okay, you're going to do it because you want to do it in the most efficient way. As an energy provider, the Exxons and the BPs of the world, they should just think, what is the energy and how can I give it to the people in the most efficient way? And if that's the way they think about it, oil would be gone tomorrow because they would just get rid of all their assets in the oil, just consider that as sunk costs and just move forward because there's so much more opportunity, so much more money to be made, but they can't because they're scared of getting rid of something that they've put so much money into, which is true. It's trillions of dollars of their capital tied up to oil wells and refineries and all these things that is just ridiculous in terms of how kludgy it is. It's all slapshot, put together kind of a thing. There's no elegance into it, and that's the way it is. That's how things work, but they need to, move forward. And of course, because they have so much money, they force governments, not just here in the United States, but around the world, to bow down to them. And the governments have to do things in a way that is, subservient in a way to the oil industry, and they cannot get away from that because the money is there to doing so. But the question about electrifying the United States to be able to give electric charge for vehicles and all that, not a problem. It is absolutely not a problem on a technological front. The only issue is strictly in the political front. It's not the cost. It is not the environmental. It is not the legal. It is not any of these things. Even societal. Most of Americans are going to be for this. They would be happy for this. It's the political one where there's a political bloc that are saying, we don't want this. Thank you very much. Don't make it happen. And that's what holds it back. That is exactly what is the thing that's holding it back, not any of the other factors involved. And that is where political leadership comes in to say, screw them, we're going to do it anyway. And we haven't had that type of political leadership since way back into the 30s, with Roosevelt, basically, when he said, we're going to do this to break over a number of different old ideas and then moved on to some new ideas. And since then, well, I think maybe Eisenhower did some, and on civil rights and stuff, Johnson did some. But since then, it's been very little in terms of political will to make that happen, unfortunately.
Thank you. Professor David.
Yes, hi. So as we move into the future, we've talked about technology, the rate of technological growth accelerating, and I loved, Rob, I loved your list of things that we have coming forward. And when you talked about AI and sensors and so forth, it strikes me that that will allow businesses, perhaps governments, but I think businesses will seize this idea first, as far as being able to use the data that comes into that and to be able to use it swiftly. When you're in a competition, if you can react faster than who you're competing against, you have the advantage. And agility is a word that's being thrown around now a lot in the business world. How quick can we adapt? How quick can we move forward? How quick can we adjust? And looking at the AI explosion, looking at sensors, looking at 5G, think of all that as infrastructure that will build faster and faster decision cycles. And I think those will be the businesses that will be able to influence voters and influence politicians and influence the buying public. And I think that's where we'll see innovation move forward the quickest. And that can be scary, but I think it is also can be very exciting. I think, well, here in the United States, each one of our states operates under the federal government, but they have considerable latitude to do their own thing, if you will. So my neighboring state of Nevada is experimenting with something that I think could bring faster decision cycles to government. They're looking at building special zones where entrepreneurs, and there's already one or two lined up for this, can come in and create their own industry and their own local government on property that they themselves own. And I look at that as an interesting experiment that perhaps could drive the public-private decision cycle faster. When I spoke earlier, I talked about all the different complexities that are involved in that. And right now, those gears turn very slowly. And as technology advances and companies wish to be more agile, I think maybe something like this experiment that's going on in Nevada could help with that. Texas is doing something similar, but I think the one that I've read about in Nevada is more fully fleshed out at this point, and that there is money lined up behind it, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But being able to keep up with the rate of change, with being able to keep up with the entrepreneurial drive, is going to be a real stress point for government in the decades ahead.
Thank you. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks for today. Thank you for joining today's session. I want to start from Mr. Rob.
Well, innovation is what should make infrastructure work better, and applied innovation to forward the technology being used for a particular infrastructure product is advised only so that you're planning for the future, not for the present. And that does mean you need to look to the future of the environment, the future of the city, where the growth areas are going to be, and whether or not there is something that's going to go in that's going to be more robust than what you're replacing, more efficient than what you're replacing, and more effective than what you're replacing. Eric talked a little bit about electric power and how easy it would be to convert to electric vehicles. Sadly, that's not really true. We're at here in the most of the West, we're at electric capacity. We don't have the capacity for electric vehicles that are coming in. Last study I saw, we had more than 2 electric cars on any block. We'd blow out the the electrical infrastructure. And right now we're using oil-fired plants for overage, and so people come home, they fire up their homes, they plug in their cars, and suddenly those green cars are producing a lot of smog because those old oil-fired plants aren't green at all. So there's a lot of effort to bring back nuclear, which is probably the safest and best energy source, at least right now. And there's a lot of effort to use the power of the earth. My brain hasn't woken up. I can't remember the term, but use the energy from the earth to power geothermal. Thank you, geothermal energy to power these plants. And they're getting down to a point where we'll probably put geothermal plants at least down in relatively small cities and towns, and deal with the fact that the loss for energy transmission is pretty significant. So if you can put generation closer to use, you're going to lose less power, and you're going to have a more efficient and cheaper underlying solution. So just think ahead, and then I've got to go because my next meeting just started and I'm getting nasty emails. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Take care. Yeah, Dr. Eric, what the concluding remarks for today? Yes.
Well, I would like to sort of conclude with a what if that didn't occur here in, at least here in California. So back in the 1970s, we had a governor, Jerry Brown, who also became the governor, in the 2000s as well. And he was derided as Governor Moonbeam, because he had this ridiculous idea of having infrastructure, of having satellites, communication satellites in particular, above. I guess obviously these satellites have to go, orbiting around the globe, and not just orbiting around California. But he had this idea of putting enough of them out there so that we would have telecommunication and satellite-based information and all these other stuff, which is exactly what we have right now. Okay, but had we done that from California back in the 70s, as he had proposed, California would probably be still 10 years ahead, maybe. I mean, things catch up very quickly, so it's very hard to make this claim, but could probably be 10 years ahead of other nations in terms of our technology for the use of the people, as far as pushing the innovation to where it is. And certainly, what would have come out of that would have been, who knows, what we're doing right now, talking on online internet and talking to each other over internet like this could have been done 20 years ago, okay, because of the bandwidth that would have been available and exactly what he was talking about. And that is an example of a what if we don't take the risk of doing infrastructure that people say, oh, this is ridiculous. Oh, you Governor Moonbeam, what the hell are you talking about, kind of a thing. Technology goes fast. They move quickly. And once you set up the structure, if you had set up the structure of the satellites and all that, then the innovators will come in and play with it. They'll come in and they'll play with it and they'll figure it out. This sort of the thing that we're using here to talk to each other across, multiple time zones and such, this would have been done by the innovators, by the entrepreneurs, and no government is going to tell us that this is what we need to be done, because who knows who's going to decide that this is what's going to work. This particular system might probably fail, and another one would be more successful. The business model that is implemented for this is probably better or worse than others, and that's how decisions are made on what works and what doesn't. It's mostly the business model and not the technology, because people are always willing to use a lesser technology if it's a hell of a lot cheaper, and so that's those are the things that people are wondering to have. And back in 1970s, when Governor Brown back then, proposed these things, we would have never have considered any of these things that we're doing right now. Okay, and we would have done it by 1990. We would have done it by 20 years of technological implementation of the structure that we create would have happened. But so that's an example of the what if when you don't apply innovation, if you don't set forward to create the infrastructure, you miss out. And we can see it because we have today to look at, and we can say that, yeah, we could have done this 20, 30 years ago. So.
Thank you, Professor David.
Yes, thanks. I enjoyed this discussion this morning. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure, and innovation being that middle word. And it means that it touches both industry on one side and the infrastructure on the other side. We talked about it not being static. We talked about moving forward into the future. We talked about industry moving into the future, infrastructure moving into the future, and I wanted to include that government needs to move into the future too, and that's why the innovation zones were worth bringing up. One thing we didn't talk as much about was moving sustainably into the future, and perhaps we'll have a discussion on that for another time. But I want to also thank Eric's comments about Governor Moonbeam. I too remember that, and that cycle is going to continue to move faster. From the 70s to the 90s, that would have been 20 years. But now we're looking at things like Amazon saying, I'm going to deliver packages to you by drone, and people rolling their eyes and saying that's science fiction, and then starting to run out pilot programs in just a few years. So this cycle of technology innovation moving faster and faster is happening. The same with the space program. We had no appreciable interest in space until there were entrepreneurs in space, and now that is moving forward very fast. And once again, when people talked about returning to the moon, developing colonies there, moving to Mars, you had those that initially rolled their eyes and said this is science fiction. And now there is lots of serious money, lots of serious science, and it's being demonstrated almost on a daily basis. Once again, that tempo is moving very quickly. So I want to challenge all of us, including those of us that try to understand the future and realize that changes are going to occur that we can't see coming, and they're going to come very fast. So we need that agile decision making as we move forward, and we need to stay open to the possibilities. And it's going to be an exciting ride. So thanks again, Sharif.
Thank you for joining today's sessions, and thank you for contributing for World Talent Economy Forums. We are trying to engage with hundreds of education institutions, corporations, as well as government and different countries, and trying to solve many things together. So hopefully your contributions can help a lot of developing nations, and by this way we can develop better policy, better projects, and we can implement better things together with the help of developed nations and the developing nations. Thank you for joining today. Thank you, Dr. Eric, and thank you, Professor David. Yes.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.